Okay, welcome to another one of our lockdown lesson tips. We're back in lockdown again, and one of the questions we've been getting from members recently with the, I guess the soft conditions on the course. We've had a fair bit of rain around recently, and one of the questions we've been getting is about chip shots and how to deal with soft ground conditions. And it's just a bit of an opportunity for me to talk to you about your wedges and the best clubs that I guess are to be used in soft ground conditions, which also leads us into a discussion about the clubs that you would use in firm ground conditions. So assuming that we're using a wedge around the green, for this video I'm just going to talk about your sand wedges. This can also apply to your gap wedge. We wouldn't really use, you can use a pitching wedge for chipping, but the pitching wedge today is now a much stronger lofted club than what a pitching wedge was, say, 20 years ago. So the pitching wedge today can be as little as 42 degrees. Your sand wedge is 56 degrees. And most clubs have a 4-degree gap between each club. So really a pitching wedge today is a little bit like what an 8-iron was 25 years ago. So for this discussion, we're really talking about your sand wedge, your lob wedge, and what we call your gap wedge, which sometimes is called an A wedge or a U wedge, or a sort of a 50 or a 52 degree wedge. But the main tool I'm focusing here on today for chipping are sort of the lob wedge and the sand wedge. Now, what we have with these wedges is they have different soles on the bottom of them. And when we've got heavy ground conditions, what we need is a wedge that is going to help us not dig too much. Now, when we have firm ground conditions, it's the opposite. We need something to help us get under the ball because there's no give in the ground, it's very firm. We need something to help us get under the ball. But when it's soft and wet, the problem is that the club will often dig into the ground too much. So what we want to be chipping with a club that has got a wider sole and a thing on the bottom of the club which we call bounce angle. So I've got two wedges here. I've got a lob wedge and a sand wedge. And on this wedge here, if we just show them to you, I'm not sure this is going to come up too well in the video, but if you look really carefully, if I get in a bit closer, you'll see that the wedge on my right here has got a much wider sole than the one over here on the left. All right, and you can get these clubs in different widths and different grinds, we call them. And so the one on the right here is what we call it's a Callaway club, and it's called a wide grind. And the one on the left is a lob wedge, which is called their standard grind. And the standard grind's narrower and it has less bounce angle, which I'll discuss in a second. And the wide sole, which you would expect, the wide sole, given its name, has a much wider base. And this club with a wider base is the one that you would tend to use in softer ground conditions. The one with a narrower base is the one that you would use when the ground's a bit firmer. So the other thing that we have here on the sand wedge is that if we have a look at it from this angle, if we look carefully here, if I hold that with the white in the background, you'll see there's a bit of an angle here from the leading edge back to the back of the sole. That's called bounce angle. And that angle there, if you have more of that, that stops the club from digging too much. All right. Now this one you'll see also has a little bit of that angle, but not as much. So this one says on the bottom, it's got 10 degrees of bounce. This is on the 60-degree lob wedge. And then over here on the sand wedge, the 56-degree club, this says it has 12 degrees. So the sand wedge has more of that angle, and that stops the club from digging too much in soft ground conditions. So what we advise is that when you're buying your wedges and you're making up your set, is that we advise that you should have one wedge that has a wide sole with a little bit more bounce angle, and you should have one wedge with it's got a narrower sole with a little bit less bounce angle. So what that does is that when you're out on the course, and often we have varying ground conditions, you might get into a bunker that's really fluffy, in which case you would use the wedge with the wider sole and the more bounce. But then if you got into a bunker or you played a different course where the sand was very thin and very firm, then when you would use your wedge that's got the narrower sole and the flatter bottom, less bounce angle. So again, with chipping out there at the moment, a little bit wet, you would tend to go for the club with the wider sole and the more bounce angle. So that's just a little bit about wedges. I hope that makes sense. It's pretty straightforward, but our recommendation is you have 2 wedges in your bag so that with whatever conditions you're faced with, you've got a club to deal with those conditions. Good luck with your chipping.